Whatever they charge us, we're charging them. Nobody can complain about that.
Donald Trump says tariff is his favourite word in the dictionary. But what happens when other countries start putting import taxes on American products? We'll discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we're going to start by talking about Donald Trump's trade policy, because that's the thing that's driving the world news this week. So the latest we've got on Wednesday is that the US and Canada kind of backed down on some of the stuff that they were considering on Tuesday. However, Donald Trump has introduced a global tariff, so a tax on imports of steel and aluminium into the US. So that affects every country that has a steel industry that exports, which includes the UK. So for the first time, the UK is now affected by Donald Trump's trade policy. So we'll talk about that. We'll also hear about the fact that Canada is retaliating on the tariffs that they are going to experience. And on Wednesday morning, the EU announced a huge package of tariffs that it will apply on American imports into the EU as they retaliate against Donald Trump's tariffs on them. And the US is gearing up for St. Patrick's Day, which means there is a visit by the Irish Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, to the White House. So I know the ideal person to commentate on that. It's our favourite Irish BBC news presenter in Washington, D.C., Caitríona Perry, who's here. Hello, Caitríona.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Are you speaking to us from the White House lawn?
I am decked out in my green here with a green fountain over the corner over my shoulder here because it's officially St. Patrick's Day at the White House, even though it's not actually St. Patrick's Day for a few days yet. But this is the day that the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, has been visiting President Trump to have a bilateral, and then later on to come back and present that glorious bowl of shamrock marking the connections between the two countries.
And did trade policy come up in their little tete-a-tete in the Oval Office?
Oh yes, trade policy front and centre, and actually really interesting is, you know, we've seen this with foreign leaders who've come to the White House before, that the initial sort of opening remarks on what used to be just a couple of photos with the journalists turns into a lengthy press conference. So the Taoiseach and the President were there for about 40 minutes or so, and actually the Taoiseach left about 5 or 6 minutes after that, so there wasn't much time for a private conversation at all, even though they'll have a few meetings later. But a very different reception to the last leader who was here, which was Volodymyr Zelensky.
And did Micheál Martin try and kind of fight the EU's case? Because, I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, she was really quite aggressive on Wednesday morning when she announced that the EU's retaliatory tariffs on the US.
Yeah, and President Trump is quite angry, I would say, about that, and he said he plans to retaliate on those retaliatory tariffs. Interestingly, though, the Taoiseach took a different approach in that he didn't really jump in at all on those remarks that President Trump was making regarding tariffs and taxation and relocating American companies based outside of America back to America, which would be a big issue for Ireland. But President Trump reiterating again those comments that we've heard so many times from him, how he feels the US is being treated unfairly by the EU. And he also said Ireland was taking advantage of the US as well. And he said he would continue levying tariffs, mentioned 200% at one time if this continued, and he wouldn't shy away from that. So kind of matching the language that we've heard from Ursula von der Leyen as well.
So whatever they charge us, we're charging them. Nobody can complain about that. Whatever it is, it doesn't even matter what it is. If they charge us 25 or 20% or 10% or 2% or 200%, then that's what we're charging them. And so I don't know why people get upset about that, because there's nothing more fair than that.
And I suppose Micheál Martin has, I mean, you know the Irish economy better than I do. Look at me Ireland-splaining to you. I do apologise. But it's just to help our listeners understand. He's got the double advantage that in the EU, trade policy is done by the European Commission. So if you're a leader of an EU member state and you actually don't want to rock the boat in the Oval Office, you've kind of got a get out from that. So he didn't need to confront Trump on that because, well, it's Ursula von der Leyen's problem. And secondly, so much of the Irish economic relationship with the US is in services rather than manufacturing. And actually, the relationship between the EU and the US in trade terms and services is much more equal than it is in terms of goods, where the EU sells a lot more to the US than the US sells to the EU.
Absolutely, and the Taoiseach did point that out, because one of the first sentences that President Trump said was, we've got a trade deficit when it comes to Ireland. Ireland's number 4 on the list of countries who have the biggest trade deficit, if you're looking at it from an American perspective, or trade surplus from an Irish perspective. But the Taoiseach did point out, as you said there, Adam, that that's on goods, but when you put services into it, it's a deficit. So he was kind of ready with a lot of those lines, and when it comes to tariffs, as you say, that's not Ireland's doing. That's an EU-wide thing, although the President did single out the pharmaceutical industry as something. He said the whole American pharmaceutical industry is on the island of Ireland. Of course it isn't, but Ireland is the 3rd biggest exporter of pharmaceutical products in the world, and that is one place that Ireland is kind of exposed, because the President has often talked about, as he did today, about American companies in Ireland making these pharmaceutical products and then reselling them back to Americans, essentially. So he feels that America is being penalised on the double. So there was a lot of talk about that pharmaceutical industry, but it was all done in a very kind of nice kind of way, and all of the President's ire directed towards the EU.
Now, I can hear Dharshini David, Chief Economics Correspondent, coming into the studio, looking to see where she can turn the knob to hear you better, Caitríona, because you're coming out of a speaker. Hello, Dharshini.
Hello. Hi.
Can you hear Caitríona, by the way?
Not really.
Okay, well, why don't me and Caitríona keep talking while we work out how you can hear her better?
Old lady hear it.
So, Caitríona, we can talk about the economic situation in America. I'm checking my stockbroking app. Not that I do a lot of stockbroking, but actually, having been red for the last few days, it's gone a little bit green, because it looks like the American stock market has kind of stabilized at a lot lower level than it's been at for the last few months, but it does look a bit more stable today.
Yeah, just about, and obviously we're many hours away from the markets actually closing, so anything can happen between now and then. But there was an inflation statistic out today showing that that's kind of stabilised, and if anything, that figure reducing ever so slightly. So that's good news. President Trump asked about that today and said it's very good news. Will that lead to prices coming down? Who knows? But it's one good step. So I think that's probably assisted the markets a little bit. And also, now that these tariffs have been levied, that uncertainty that was there's some bit of certainty in terms of they're in place now, and there seems to be a bit of a détente between Canada and the US in particular. Of course, the Canadian Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Mayor of Ontario going to have talks this week with the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. So again, an indication of at least a temporary stability on that matter.
Dharshini, I'll get you to talk about the UK and the EU response to Donald Trump in a second. But I just think, with your many years as an economist, and you did global trade for a while, do you want to just put in proportion and perspective what's been happening this week, both in terms of like American trade policy and the effect of that on the American economy and the world economy?
Well, as Caitríona says, anything can happen, right? And that seems to have been the mantra of this week. And what we've seen is, of course, that strange dance going on between the White House and the rest of the world, quite honestly. But Marco Rubio put it quite succinctly today when he talked about why is it that the Trump administration is putting these tariffs on steel and aluminium and on the rest of the world. And this is not the first time we've been in this particular dispute. And they said, well, it's about unfair practices by the rest of the globe. So this perception from America, and it's sometimes an argument that other countries have made when it comes to steel making in particular. The likes of China have subsidised their industry. And yeah, that means they can produce more cheaply, and people lose market share and they get annoyed by that. But it's more than that, because these are what are called strategic industries. Because particularly at the time when we're talking about defence, steel is very important to the defence industry. Steel is very important to the travel industry as well. So you want to have a regular, reliable supply of it, and not just sort of, say, OK, our competitors do it better and more cheaply, so we're just going to leave it to them to do. And that is one of the reasons why you're seeing this kind of protectionist nature coming back. The other, of course, is this whole notion about bringing jobs back to America and beefing up America's industry. Now, we heard Caitríona there talking about uncertainty. Are we feeling less uncertain when we look at the way the White House has behaved over the course of this week? Not really. I mean, I think that is the big key thing at the moment, because when we look at what's happened in stock markets, and you're absolutely right, and I'm really sorry about this for your own personal finances, but stock markets are doing a lot less well than they were at the time of the election. And there is that muttering on Wall Street of Trumpcession, this idea that that uncertainty itself is weighing on businesses, is weighing on consumers. I've come from talking to the guy who runs Barnes & Noble, right, the book chain in the US. And it was interesting to hear him say actually business is going quite well for them, because in uncertain times, people want to bury their heads in a good book, get away from the world. But quite honestly, that may mean that things aren't going that great as far as the American economy is concerned.
And Caitríona, how does Donald Trump deal with this economic uncertainty? Because, I mean, a classic American president would be looking at the economic numbers and getting a bit worried. But Donald Trump is not a classic American president.
Indeed, he's not, and he seems to be braving it out. I mean, he's talked about, well, or at least refused to rule out the notion of a recession happening in the US this year, which gives everyone the jitters, the concept of that. You know, when he talks about the impact of these trade wars and the levying of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs and so on, he talks about how, oh, well, there'll be a little bit of disruption or a little bit of pain, but it'll be worth it in the end. So, I mean, remember with President Trump, he is an expert marketeer, and he definitely likes to sort of set the tone and set the narrative. So I think he's trying to be sort of positive about these extreme negatives in a way, in the hope that that will filter down to the American people who elected him, as we've said so many times, on this notion that he would reduce the cost of living, that he would improve the economy, you know, that he would reverse what people thought was a bad situation under Joe Biden. Of course, things weren't that bad. They were just quite bad at telling the American people about it. And that hasn't happened yet. And the big question for President Trump, and more so for the elected Republicans on Capitol Hill, is how long are the American people prepared to kind of wait for things to get better? And definitely if we're into a situation where we're in a recession, that bodes very badly for the wider Republican Party.
And Dharshini, just in terms of what's been happening in the UK today, because of course the UK is affected by these steel and aluminium tariffs because they're on everyone that makes and exports steel. What did you make of Keir Starmer's response to this afternoon? Well,
it's interesting, isn't it? Because our strategy here in the UK is to sit back, do nothing, cross our fingers and hope that Trump will remember that we're going to have this new economic arrangements somewhere on the horizon. But it is interesting to watch that happen at the same time as the EU and Canada are taking a very different stance. Now, there is a reason for that. We are far less reliant on America as a customer of our steel. Our steel-making industry is much smaller as a proportion of our economy. It's 0.1% of our output, right? 0.1% of jobs in this country. Not to say it's not important, but it may be one of those areas that the government's thinking we're not going to go to war on this. We're going to sit back, wait and see if actually that visit to the White House is going to pay off. That trade deal that you and I have talked about in the past, right?
For our whole adult lives.
For our whole adult lives and beyond that as well. When we were babies, we were talking about it. It looks quite different this time round because obviously they're talking about tech and the likes. But remember, in the dim and distant past, they were talking about bringing down tariffs. Now it's more about avoiding extra tariffs being imposed. It's a whole new game now. And it's very much, cross your fingers and hope.
Although, I mean, Trump, it's such a cliche to say he's very transactional, but we've seen examples in the last few days of him backing down. So, as Caitríona was alluding to, where the mayor of Ontario threatens to put a 25% surcharge on exports of electricity to 3 American states, Trump then threatens even higher tariffs. They both back down. So it's not all escalate, is it?
I mean, the art of the deal, he seems to enjoy that engagement, that kind of conflict out there on the playing field. So you hear, and we've heard this before as well, by the way, the EU weaponising the likes of Harley-Davidson motorbikes and Levi's jeans. And bourbon as well, all of which I'm hoping is not going to affect you. But, these are things that have been weaponised before because they know it hits and hurts in Republican heartlands, right, in America. But we've seen, as you say, the way that Trump has reacted to previous moves. Is this going to really, it's a gamble, right? Is this going to actually prod Trump into responding, going, actually, I'll back down? Or is he going to double down and say, EU, as we've just heard him say, I'm not very happy with you right now. Those retaliatory tariffs coming in April, guess what? They're going full steam ahead.
And Caitríona, I know you've got to go because it's a busy news day there, but you know I always love to end with a philosophical question for you. And last week on Newscast, we were talking about the shake-up of the federal government, and you were talking about how that's affected house prices in Washington, D.C., because so many public servants are losing their jobs. My philosophical question for you today is, how is the American system coping with Donald Trump doing all these things just by himself? Because normally trade policy is a thing that is shared between the White House and Congress. He's just doing it all himself. And also I'm then throwing in things like the fact he did a car advert for Tesla on the White House lawn where you're standing yesterday. That's quite unusual.
It is quite unusual. It's one of the most bizarre moments I think I've ever seen here at the White House. It kind of felt like you were watching a second-hand car salesman ad or something, with the president extolling the virtues of the various different models of Tesla and, talking about how great Elon Musk is. Of course, we've heard him say that many times. But yeah, he is going alone. This is what he said he would do. But at the same time, you have the members of the House and Senate up on Capitol Hill trying to agree some kind of funding budget to keep the government open beyond Friday. The House of Representatives managed to do that because President Trump now has incredible power over the party, and people who were kind of refusing to toe the line in the previous Congress have all fallen in his step this time, but not out of the woods yet. The Senate still has to agree that deal, and that needs the agreement of some Democrats, and of course they have pledged not to give any assistance to this president whatsoever. The issue of housing did come up in the Oval Office earlier, actually, because it's a major issue in Ireland, huge housing crisis and homelessness crisis there, and President Trump said, oh, that's a crisis I'd love to have in this country. That means you're winning, that means you're successful.
Interesting. Right, Caitríona, before you go, are you going to add something to the Newscast playlist that we're doing this week in honour of the King having his own playlist on Apple?
Oh my gosh, wow.
On the spot.
You put me on the spot.
Do you want to email it in
incredibly
afterwards? Like we're on like 1990s local radio? Email it in afterwards. We do requests.
Text it in.
Yes, exactly.
List.
Oh, yeah, why don't you
list.
WhatsApp us on 0330-123-9480? We'll be doing Guess the Secret Sound next. Anyway,
Normal
Caitríona,
charges apply.
And can you play a request for me and all the girls in my class?
Yeah, exactly. Although we've got quite strict copyright rules. So anyway, Caitríona, I'll let you go and scratch your head about that. But thank you very much.
Okay, talk soon. Bye.
Dharshini, I'll give you some time to think about what your playlist entry is going to be. But is there anything else we should be thinking about the British economy today?
Is there anything else? I mean, do we have any space to think about anything else, in terms of bandwidth mentally and the rest of it? Look, this is quite an important month for the UK economy. We've kind of forgotten about that. It's got pushed into the shadows, hasn't it? But we have got this spring statement coming up. And, Rachel Reeves was watching this with some trepidation, thinking, hang on a minute, I've already got issues when it comes to trying to balance those books in the way I want to and finding the money I want for public services. This could make my predicament even worse, what we're seeing going on at the moment.
And I suppose, it's already a tricky job for the Office of Budget Responsibility to forecast growth next year, the year after, 5 years out, 10 years out. I suppose things being so unpredictable in the world make that job even harder, which means the ultimate numbers that Rachel Reeves will be judged on and will be judging herself on are kind of presumably all over the place.
Well, this is a really strange thing, right, Adam? Because I know you're a big fan of OBR
Love the
books.
OBR,
you love
yeah.
the OBR books, autographed collection of books somewhere, I'm sure. But their forecast, they have to give her a preliminary forecast so she can work out how to react to get the numbers to add up, right? That forecast was closed at the beginning of this month. And now she comes back with her measures and they finalise their forecast, right? So how do you cope in a world where, as we've seen, hour by hour, minute by minute, POTUS in the White House is changing his mind on trade policy which directly influences the UK and our well-being as well. It's a hugely difficult balancing act.
But I suppose that's the argument for having the headroom, as they call it, isn't it? The money left over at the end of the Parliament that means you've got a bit of a buffer for things happening in the world. And that's why you might want to cut some things that people don't want cut, even though you could actually still there's still a bit of headroom in the budget.
Totally. And, this is a really, we'll talk about uncertainty. All these forecasts never pan out as we expect. And chancellor after chancellor.
In fact, the OBR are often too optimistic about what's happening.
Often are. I mean, goodness knows, right now they're probably not feeling that optimistic. But what we've seen chancellor after chancellor do to get that headroom is to go, 5 years' time, 3 years' time, whenever my rules apply, I'm just going to trim those spending totals a little bit. Jeremy Hunt did it. And then it comes nearer the time, and in reality, they pile the money up a bit more. So we're going to have some possibly quite worrying headlines coming out of this, but, don't get too bogged down in it. On the other hand, those welfare changes we're likely to see detailed in the next few weeks. And it's going to be interesting because you're telling people, and we have had a huge problem with the welfare bill exploding, but you're telling people, if you can work, we want you to work, go and look for a job. Here's a question. When I talk to business leaders, they are saying national insurance contributions going up. It's job creation that we're thinking about now. And that's probably where we're going to see the axe fall. It's all very well saying people get off benefits, find yourself a job. But if you're seeing unemployment rising at the same time, that's a pretty hard one to square, right? To actually find those.
Well, as in employers, because it's more expensive to employ somebody now. Employers aren't necessarily in the mood to hire loads of people coming off the benefit system.
Totally. I mean, hire full stop, and particularly at the lower end of the income scale, because we know that's where these changes really tend to hit as far as employers are concerned. And what's running through many minds at the moment is, well, I can squeeze my profit margins, I can put my prices up, or I could just cut back on the hours I give people, perhaps not expand my business, perhaps not hire as many people. And that is a problem when you're trying to get the welfare bill down and get people back into work. So there's all those things to think about. In the background looming, of course, is all of this going on. There's external forces that you can't really control. And we've had enough of it. I mean, 5 years on from COVID, right? Shock after shock. Where do we go from here?
Dharshini, thank you very much. What's your entry for the playlist? You've had plenty of time to think about it now. I went for Katy Perry, Firework.
Why?
Why not? That's the question. Why not?
Okay, I'm going to be down with the kids then.
Okay.
Because we've been talking about bourbon, and all I can think about is bourbon and Jack Daniels. I'm going to go for Bar Song by Shabuzi.
I actually don't know that song. I'll go and play it, and then hopefully we'll be able to play 10 seconds of it at the end of the week.
Summer of 2024.
Do you want to give a little...
No, nobody wants that.
Okay.
Nobody wants that.
No karaoke today. Dharshini, thank you. Right, that's trade policy. Let's now talk about war and peace, and specifically, what is the reaction to the talks that the US and Ukraine had in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia on Wednesday, where they both agreed that they would pursue a 30-day ceasefire with Russia, and that the US would restart its intelligence sharing with Ukraine and also its supply of military aid. We can chat now to somebody who's been on Newscast before. It's Christopher Steele, who is the former head of the Russia desk at MI6. He's the author of Unredacted, Russia, Trump and the Fight for Democracy. And he's now a director of Orbis Business Intelligence. And he is the person who has read War and Peace in the original Russian. And he's here now. Hello, Chris.
Hello there, Adam.
Well, let's just get your reaction to what was happening when we were recording the last episode of Newscast last night with the news out of Jeddah that the US and Ukraine seem to be back on the same page.
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians have turned it around quite spectacularly, really, given that the argument in the Oval Office only happened 10 days ago or something.
12, I think it was 12.
12 was it altogether. But essentially what they've done is they've agreed to this temporary ceasefire, which, given that the Russian army is making some small gains at the moment, is no bad thing for them. And they put Russia on the back foot now. And it'll be very interesting to see whether Putin politically is able to accept a ceasefire in this current situation.
Well, because it's already been ruled out, hasn't it, by the spokeswoman from the Russian Foreign Office last week?
Yes, but I suspect that she might be thrown under the trolleybus at some point if necessary. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Putin and the Russians to do this. And I think they have been outmaneuvered. The Ukrainians...
Oh, how so?
Well, the Ukrainians, from what I understand, have always been, since Trump was elected, aiming to basically portray themselves as willing to compromise and willing to sign up to a peace deal, and to show up Russia for not being prepared to do that, so to call their bluff. And I suspect that's where we are now.
And so do you think we might be in a world where there's a bit of a vibe shift, and so actually it's gone from Trump pressurising Ukraine to now Trump and Ukraine will jointly pressurise Russia, and actually this whole conversation in a couple of days' time could feel very, very different in terms of who's pressuring who?
No, it certainly could, but I would underline that the fundamental issues here aren't going to change if there's a ceasefire. everyone would welcome a ceasefire, of course, not least the Ukrainians, who are losing a lot of men at the moment. But I think fundamentally it's about what sort of sequencing then thereafter takes place, particularly actually whether one Russian demand, which America seemed to back and perhaps has backed away from now, was that there was to be an election in Ukraine, a presidential election certainly, before the negotiations were drawn out for an actual peace treaty. The Americans seem to have changed their position on that, and that's quite significant.
Oh, so actually this idea of the last few weeks that Trump is kind of signing up to everything that Putin is asking for turns out to be less true as weeks go on.
Certainly in this regard, and you wonder why that is, whether somebody like Rubio has stepped in and perhaps surreptitiously managed to switch the sequencing. I don't think Trump is exactly on top of all the details. But it's going to be interesting to see how the sequencing pans out. And it's going to be very interesting to see what concessions the Russians are prepared to make when they think they're on the front foot. I mean, others of us don't believe that they are. Their attrition rate is still massive, 1,500 a day killed and wounded. And in the Donbass, they're not made much progress at all in recent weeks.
Marco Rubio used this phrase that I remember from the Brexit days about the ball now being in Russia's court. Now that the ball's gone over there, like what do we know about the Russian decision-making process? Because it seems to be it's just Putin sits by himself and decides.
Yes, it is. And I think one of the problems with decision-making in Russia in the last few years has been that Putin's living in a bit of a bubble and that his courtiers, because that's what I think they are, take him news that he wants to hear and they don't bring the difficult news to him. I think they've distorted the progress they made in Ukraine all the way along and the performance of their armed forces. So there's a problem in transmitting real information up to the leadership in Russia these days, and that leads to bad decision-making and bad governance. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if Putin is not fully in the picture as to what the actual situation on the ground is in Ukraine, and maybe also the political situation internally in Ukraine, where I think, ironically, Zelensky, who had been losing quite a lot of support because of the row with Trump, has actually gained it again, and people have gone back behind him, all the opposition, people like Poroshenko, the former president.
How will we know what the Russian position actually is? Will they find ways of kind of signaling to the world what they actually want, or will this all be done behind closed doors and be incredibly secretive?
You'll see hints of it, but for example, we've received indications in recent days that Lavrov, the foreign minister, is being marginalised now from this process, and that the key figure on the Russian side is this Kirill Dmitriev, who you may have heard of, who runs their sort of national investment sovereign wealth fund, and that probably him and Witkoff are the two key players now.
Trump's
going
envoy,
forward.
yeah. And Steve Witkoff is going to go to Moscow at some point in the next few days. So actually an American official on Russian soil, that's a big change from the last few years, isn't it?
Well, he's been before, of course. He went a couple of weeks ago to secure the release of a prisoner, what we would call a hostage in common English. And it's very strange because he has no particular knowledge or expertise on Russia whatsoever. He's a property developer, a golf buddy of Trump's, and in fact, even within the Trump administration is focused on the Middle East. And yet he has been brought to the fore above Rubio, it seems, in terms of negotiating with Moscow, above Waltz, the national security advisor, and particularly above Kellogg, the general who was appointed as the Ukraine envoy, who seems completely marginalised as far as I can tell.
And you talked about Russia's position being actually relatively weak, and you talked about just the number of men they're losing on the battlefield. What are other things that lead you to the conclusion that their position is weak?
I think their economy is weak, and I think that if you look at even actually, I think the sanctions that we've imposed are beginning really to bite. I've seen some figures about oil exports in the last couple of weeks, which indicate that oil exports from Russia have significantly fallen by maybe 4 or 5 million barrels a day, which is pretty significant. That's about 20%, 15-20% of their exports. So there are indications that sanctions are biting. I think the Russian economy is in a bad situation. There's also talk about Nabulina, who you'll know is the central bank chairwoman, who's a very competent technocrat, about her actually either losing control of policy or leaving office. So I think there's quite a lot going on under the surface in Russia. Also, I think the trade with China has declined, which is remarkable given that axis of political alliance that we've seen.
Oh, what's going on there with trade with China? Because they're meant to have like the partnership with no limits. So maybe there is a limit, and it's about how much China is willing to buy from Russia.
Well, I've never believed it's a partnership with no limits. It's a mercantilist partnership that benefits China. And what China is afraid of, I think, are two things. One is secondary sanctions, and two is getting out.
In other words, sanctions that are designed to hit Russia but end up being applied to people who do business with Russia.
Correct. So if a Chinese bank is moving Russian money around, for example, they could get sanctioned by either the EU or America or both. And that's quite a significant sort of stick, if you like, over China. But I also think there are issues relating to North Korea and China and Russia, where the Chinese are not at all happy about the role North Korea is playing in Russia, the troops, or indeed that Russia may be trying to stir up unrest inside the Korean peninsula, which is not in China's interest.
Just going to your point about the weakness of the Russian economy, isn't it a case of like if the Russian economy collapses more slowly than support for Ukraine collapses, then Russia can keep going for quite a while?
That's true, but of course...
Because it's not on the verge of instant economic collapse, is what I'm getting at.
It's not, but I think that the social problems in Russia as well are very profound. There are a lot of the young male population, particularly the well-educated population, has left the country to avoid the draft. And you've got significant problems of troops going back to their settlements and their hometowns with PTSD and all the other things. There's been a massive increase, for example, in the murder rate in Russia since the war started. Huge increase of something like 900%. And this is all the sort of social fallout from the war. And it's suppressed in Russia in terms of the media and in terms of what even our media can see and cover. But it's there, and it's very significant, I think, in the longer term.
And I thought it was significant the other day there, that big drone attack on the apartment blocks in Moscow, because then you think, well, hang on, if you're the Ukrainians and you're trying to pressure Russia to accept a ceasefire in the air, well, then a quite dramatic attack in the homeland of Russia is quite a good argument for why you should sign up to a ceasefire in the air.
Yes, and one of the things which Ukraine has done very well in recent times is both the drone warfare itself, but also strikes within deep inside Russia of things like oil refineries and other facilities. So that's been a real success story for them, independently, actually, of the West. And I think they probably got a lot to teach our armed forces in drone technology and these long-distance strikes.
Right, last question, and it's a process question. What's your take on just how these negotiations seem to so far be being conducted? It seems to involve lots of people going to Saudi Arabia and not necessarily the people that you want to have face-to-face negotiations meeting face-to-face. What's your take on just how it's kind of being choreographed at the moment?
I think the fundamental problem is the Americans don't really have a plan. And it looks as though perhaps we're trying to backfill that in Europe, particularly people like Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, and others in Europe, having to come up with a plan basically to get the Americans off the hook in that regard. I think that there's a sort of undue haste on the part of Trump to get some kind of ceasefire and deal without actually thinking it through properly. That's my big fear, that this is really quite chaotic and it's being made up as we go along. Let's see if I'm proved wrong. I hope I am, but I suspect that is what's happening.
Aren't these things always made up as people go along?
Not entirely. I think that, whether you look at different plans that we've had, Northern Ireland peace process and other things, there was a clear roadmap there. And I don't think there is a clear roadmap in the case of Ukraine in this particular instance.
And it's interesting listening to people talking about a potential peace settlement. You need a roadmap for that being implemented and enforced and people having confidence in it as well. You can't just say, here, deal done, let's all walk away.
Well, as we were saying just earlier, the sequencing is a key part of that. And if there's a fundamental disagreement over the sequencing before they even begin, and if America's changed its position over sequencing without actually vocalising that properly, then that shows you the degree of uncertainty and chaos that could come about. I hope it doesn't, but there's a risk of it, certainly.
And last question, I promise. You mentioned this guy, Jonathan Powell, who is the UK National Security Advisor, brought in by Keir Starmer last year. Very, very well known at Westminster because he was Tony Blair's chief of staff and very effective at that job. Do you buy this briefing that actually it was Jonathan Powell going to Kyiv and kind of instructing Zelensky and the Ukrainian government how to get out of the hole they were in?
I certainly think
that happened.
Yeah, I certainly think his advice would have been taken very seriously. I dealt with Jonathan Powell when I was back in government many years ago, and he actually at that point had a direct dialogue going with a guy who was the chief of the presidential administration in Russia at the time, Sobyanin, who's now the mayor of Moscow. So he has quite a good deal of experience of dealing with Russians and not just Putin, people underneath Putin who are still significant in the system. And I suspect he's a very good networker, and he's kept in touch with people, and he's able to bring a wisdom and a sort of cool head to this, which some of the others, like Witkoff, just don't have the background or the hinterland, if you like, of being able to do.
I mean, I don't know Jonathan Powell, but I've interviewed him a few times when he was doing jobs out of government. And he has this amazing way of giving one-word answers to questions, which as a journalist, you expect. Don't worry, this is not such a way of saying you've been talking too much. Don't worry. I mean, it's just like, you'll say, what do you think about this? And he'll say, bad, or good, or it's got potential. And then you're like, oh, all right. So he doesn't give a lot away.
But he gives fairly straight answers, and that's always important, I think, in negotiation. And of course, he was involved, I think, in the Northern Ireland process as well.
Oh, heavily, yeah. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's all for another jam-packed episode of Newscast. But just before we go, to save my cultural blushes, I of course know Shabuzi and his song, A Bar Song, brackets, tipsy, close brackets, which was Dharshini's contribution to the Newscast playlist. I just didn't know that was the name of that song and that was the name of the artist. Because I don't know about you, but I listen to a lot of music while I'm running. And when you're listening to music streaming, it doesn't tell you who you're listening to. So you can hum along to the song, but I have no idea who it is. That's my defense anyway. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye-bye.